The Kidder Overview of Understanding Ethics, Part 1. There are many examples of individuals choosing wrong over right in various organizations. We read about it in the news, we talk about it at work, organizations present examples. However, the real challenge regarding ethics is dealing with right versus right, where you have two choices, both are right for different reasons. Kidder presents the example of the librarian. This is based on a true story. One evening in a small town, a librarian is at the reference desk. The reference desk takes telephone calls for questions for looking up information. A man called that evening and asked several questions regarding the rape laws for the state. The librarian wrote down those questions, and since there were several questions, she asked if it would be okay if she took his phone number and she would call him back before the end of the evening. He said okay and gave her his number. As soon as she hung up, a man who was sitting a couple of tables away from her desk got up, walked over to her counter, and flashed a badge. He was a police detective. And he said, "I could not help but overhear the conversation you had regarding questions about rape laws. We had a really bad rape case last night. Could I have that number so I can just see if this is the possible suspect?" The librarian at that moment was at a dilemma. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. Here are the four dilemmas of right versus right as outlined by Kidder. First of all, sometimes we have the dilemma of truth versus loyalty, where we want to stand true to truth, not be dishonest in any way, but sometimes loyalty is a conflict. For instance, in an organization, you have just been given information in a high-level meeting, but then you were instructed not to share this information. You leave the meeting. Someone else asks you a question whom you know is a good employee, who you have a deep relationship with, and they said they guessed what the meeting was about. And then they ask you, is that what the meeting was about? Well, that is a challenge, truth versus loyalty. The other dilemma is individual versus community, looking at the individual's rights versus the community rights. We're going to talk about this in just a second. Short-term versus long-term. Sometimes there are values that appear to be pressing at the moment, but then you have to take a look at the long term. Which value is greater? Solving a problem in the immediate or taking the hard road and dealing with something in the long term. An example that might be more personal is a parent wanting to provide attention for their child at a certain time. Children are only going to be at an impressionable age for a period of time. However, the parent also has a responsibility to focus on work so that the parent can provide for the child not only immediately but in the long term. And sometimes there's a struggle of short-term value at the appropriate time versus long-term commitment. Justice versus mercy. This is an example of where there are situations and organizations where the appropriate means is to provide justice, but then also we believe in forgiveness, giving people a second chance. That oftentimes puts people in a dilemma. In terms of the way we think in dealing with these dilemmas, Kidder presents three principles. One is called end-based thinking. This is where the end provides justification for the means. And the greatest issue is, what is the greater good? It's called utilitarianism, and it's based on consequentialism. In other words, a decision is made due to the consequence. This is also called teleological. And basically what it says is, what the decision that needs to be made is the one that is good for the greater number of people. Even if an individual or a small group of people have to suffer some level of injustice or maybe not quite a true fairness, if the greater good is achieved, that is the decision. Rule-based thinking, based on the work of Immanuel Kant, is based on the categorical imperative that says, act on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, meaning applied in all cases, not situationally. It is a non-consequentialism. In other words, it doesn't matter what the good is for the greater number of people. What is right and needs to be consistent. It's based on deontological, which is duty. A third way of thinking is care-based thinking, putting love for others first, based on the golden rule, do to others what you would have them do to you. Philosophers call this reversibility. How would you feel if you were the recipient rather than the perpetrator of your actions? Let's take a look at the analysis of these three principles. The librarian, right versus right. Of the four major dilemmas, the individual versus the community best fits the scenario presented earlier. Why? We have the individual, the phone, the person who called in asking questions, versus the general safety of the community. In end-based thinking, if the librarian used this thinking, one immediate conclusion could be that the librarian should give the phone number to the detective, since there is the safety of the community at large. And what if we change the scenario a little bit, and let's say we've just had 7 rapes in a row in the last week? Would that then prompt the librarian to hand over that phone number to the detective to see if that person was a suspect? Rule-based thinking, it is non-consequentialism. It says what is right no matter how many people are affected. So the librarian works by the librarian code, that people have the right to ask for any information without judgment. It's a blend of the concept of privacy and also the right of free thinking in a free society. What if the caller was a student writing a paper, asking questions? What if it was just somebody who was just curious because they had had a conversation with a family member? The idea is that until there is additional information or evidence, the librarian code is that it doesn't matter if there were 20 rapes in a row, the librarian should not turn over that phone number to the detective. That's rule-based thinking. That is universal. We assume privacy. We assume confidentiality. Care-based thinking is a little bit trickier because it depends upon whom the librarian is caring for. If the librarian caring for the right of the individual, if the librarian caring for the right of all those, or the victim of the night before, or potential future victim, the safety of the community. And the issue is, it depends, because on the sense of the individual, the librarian might say, well, you know what, if I made this phone call, I would not want a librarian to give out that number. However, if somebody had been a rape victim, they would say, yes, I would want that number because we might find the suspect and prevent future incidents. The real issue here is that when we deal with right versus right, there's seldom an easy answer. However, thinking of the 3 principles of reasoning assists us in trying to make good decisions.